Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a big question, one that I think really defined the 2010s, which is why did the 2016 presidential election feel so deeply and profoundly weird?
It's a great question.
I mean, think back to that year, the chaos, the constant, just bizarre news cycles. There was this sense that fundamental norms were shattering daily.
Right.
For a lot of us, it really felt like the political universe had suddenly gone completely off the rails. It was, as Adam Gopnik of The New Yorker put it, the moment we suspected we were living in a computer simulation and something has recently gone haywire within it.
That's a great way to put it. And that chaotic sort of visceral reaction is completely understandable. The reality was loud, it was messy, and it felt unprecedented.
It really did.
But, and this is the key, when you move past the noise and you look at the actual data, the bedrock of political science, a profoundly counterintuitive conclusion emerges.
Okay.
A political scientist, Larry Bartels, studied the election results, and what he found was that 2016 was not a glitch. It was, if anything, too stable.
Too stable. That's the part that I have to say truly shocked me when I first came across this research. How can you possibly describe a race that featured such a disruptive, norm-shattering candidate as stable?
Because the results themselves, the actual votes, mostly fell right back into these highly predictable, statistically reliable grooves.
The same ones we'd seen before.
Exactly. The same ones established by previous contests, whether it was Obama versus Romney in 2012 or, Bush versus Kerry back in 2004. If you knew someone's party registration, their vote in 2016 was almost perfectly predictable.
So the underlying structure just held.
It held firm, regardless of all the drama being played out on the stage.
And that stability, as you said, that's the central paradox we have to wrestle with here. Because the Republican nominee was anything but standard.
Oh, not at all.
I mean, we're talking about a thrice-married billionaire, a former Democrat who had been publicly, dismissive of core conservative ideas for decades. He was openly supportive of things like Social Security and Medicare.
Policies that traditional movement conservatives absolutely loathed and had loathed since the very beginning.
Right. And yet, when the votes were counted, he won 88% of self-identified Republicans.
It's an incredible number. That minimal drop-off from past Republican performance, despite the sheer oddity of the man and all the policy contradictions he represented, that is the whole story.
The candidate was just absorbed by the party.
He was absorbed by the predictable, rigid structure of American partisanship. It proved that the candidate, in some ways, matters less than the party label.
It is wild to think that the single most unusual major party candidate in modern history was simply processed as just another Republican by the vast majority of voters.
Well, it speaks to the enormous, almost inescapable gravitational pull that party polarization now exerts on our system.
So we're locked in.
We are so locked into our political identities that there is virtually no candidate, no piece of damning information, and no external condition that can force us to actually change our minds about who we're going to vote for.
So we just rationalize whatever happens.
We will instinctively rationalize and justify almost anything so long as it ultimately helps our side win. And this dynamic, it produces a politics that is just devoid of accountability, where all the guardrails and standards dissolve under the pressure of identity.
Okay, so that's our mission today. To understand this master story, the logic of polarization, we are going to explore how we evolved from a system that was built on these cross-cutting conflicts and fluid compromises to one that's governed by what some people call the mega-identity. And this isn't just about Republicans moving right and Democrats moving left. It's about how we, as a collection of individually rational actors, have created a system where our combined efforts produce a profoundly dysfunctional yet statistically predictable whole.
It's the architecture of division itself that we have to explore.
To really understand the depth of our current divide, I think we have to look back at the historical norms. I mean, there was a period that political scientists used to define as necessary for American democracy's stability.
Right. They believed that for the system to survive, American parties had to overlap substantially. In principle, in policy, in everything. We had to have these cross-cutting conflicts that sort of soften the edges.
It's a concept that just sounds, totally alien to us today, right?
It does. The internal makeup of the parties was deliberately messy. Ticket splitting, voting for a Republican president and a Democratic senator, that was common. Ideological fluidity was the norm. We didn't have these hardened teams.
And we can see this ideological messiness so clearly in the 80s and 90s. On the Republican side, you have President George H.W. Bush signing landmark legislation that, today would be considered fundamentally against what the modern GOP stands for.
Precisely. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a massive expansion of civil rights and federal regulatory power.
Unthinkable today.
And even more significantly, he implemented a cap-and-trade program for sulfur dioxide emissions to reduce acid rain. Cap-and-trade is a market-based approach to environmental regulation. But today, any major environmental measure is treated as some radical left-wing threat.
But back then it was bipartisan, signed by a Republican.
And the Democrats were just as ideologically fragmented. President Bill Clinton, he ran against the traditional left wing of his own party. He famously declared the era of big government is over.
He was focused on deficit reduction, he passed NAFTA with Republican support, and he signed legislation that fundamentally reformed and, well, slashed welfare programs.
And that ability of both parties to house such wide ideological diversity, from liberal Republicans like Jacob Javits to conservative Democrats in the South, that was the system's genius. It ensured that no matter who won, the underlying system of governance wouldn't be rejected entirely by the other side.
Okay, the healthcare debate provides the perfect and I think really shocking contrast for this collapse of overlap. Let's go back to 1965, the passage of Medicare.
Medicare was, by any measure, a massive European-style single-payer health system for the elderly, created by a Democratic president. Ideologically, it was a huge liberal win.
But it got Republican support.
Significant Republican support. 70 votes in the House, 13 in the Senate. Republicans knew the system needed reform, and even if they disagreed with its specific mechanism, they were willing to participate. They were willing to come to the table.
Okay, now jump forward 45 years, 2010. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. As we mentioned, this policy was explicitly modeled off of market-based ideas.
Yes, the individual mandate, the reliance on private insurers, all of these were initially Republican ideas, including the reforms that Mitt Romney enacted in Massachusetts.
So ideologically, it was actually less extreme than Medicare.
Much less extreme. It was a compromised public-private system. Yet when it came time to vote, it received exactly 0 Republican votes.
0.
In either chamber of Congress. 0. The parties were unable to compromise on a policy that was structurally rooted in conservative thought, while decades earlier, they easily compromised on a far more liberal policy.
0 votes is more than just a statistic. It's a profound revelation about the state of American governance. It proves the conflict is no longer about what the policy itself, but the who.
Whose side proposes it? Whose side opposes it? That identity conflict completely overrides the history of the policy, the content of the policy, everything.
It shows this dramatic disappearance of the middle ground. I mean, in 1980, even political junkies had a hard time clearly articulating the differences between the two parties on a lot of core issues.
Right. And today, even the most inattentive voter is crystal clear on the divide because the agendas have, quote, diverged sharply. It's just easier to tell apart a donkey and an elephant than it is to tell apart a donkey and a mule.
So this brings us to a really necessary clarification. We're talking about sorting, not just raw polarization. We have to distinguish between those two concepts.
It is a critical distinction, yeah. Polarization means that opinions cluster at the extremes, leaving no middle ground. Sorting, however, means that people's existing opinions align perfectly with their party label.
The cannabis analogy you mentioned earlier makes this perfectly clear. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Imagine a country where 40% want cannabis outlawed, 40% want it legalized, and 20% are undecided. Now, if the Democratic and Republican parties both contain an equal mix of all three groups, the system is what we'd call unsorted.
Okay, so it's all mixed up.
Exactly. But if, over time, everyone who wants legalization moves into the Democratic Party, and everyone who wants to outlaw it joins the Republican Party, the system is now perfectly sorted.
And what's so fascinating there is that the country's overall distribution of beliefs hasn't changed at all. It's still 40-40-20, but the parties are now at each other's throats.
Correct. The beliefs are now perfectly aligned with party identity. Polarization is the next step, when those undecided 20% feel compelled to choose a side and their beliefs start to cluster at the polls. Sorting accelerates polarization, but the initial, crucial, and defining step in modern American politics was the sorting of identities.
And we established that this sorting happened kind of independent of ideological extremism, right? The Obamacare example showed that the system became maximally sorted over a relatively moderate policy.
The mechanism of identity is what matters. If you're a Republican, you oppose the Democratic bill, regardless of its history or ideological content. The hostility and the lack of cooperation we see now is purely a function of team identity, not ideological rigidity.
But this process didn't stop at ideology. It started fusing everything else. And that's what leads to the creation of what Liliana Mason calls the mega-identity.
The mega-identity is the stacking of different social and demographic markers onto a single political identity. So in 1952, the demographic differences between the two parties were pretty modest, except for race and region, Southern whites and Protestants.
And today?
Today, race, religion, geography, culture, education level, even what media you consume, they're all deeply and uniformly intertwined with your political identity.
They're like magnets. If you know one variable, say someone's education level, you can predict the other variables with pretty high accuracy.
Absolutely. And this leads to profound geographic sorting. We see this stunning nationalization of state voting patterns since the early 2000s.
So if a state goes for a Democratic president, it's almost certain to vote for Democratic members of Congress.
It's a near-perfect correlation. Alan Abramowitz and Stephen Webster found that the correlation went from about 0.54 decades ago to 0.97 by 2018. We become fixed in political place.
I want to spend a moment on the data regarding landslide counties because this is where the physical reality of the sorting really hits home for you, the listener.
This data is critical because it tells us about our lived environment. Landslide counties are those where the winning presidential candidate got over 60% of the vote. In 1992, only 39% of voters lived in a county like that.
And by 2016?
That percentage had shot up dramatically to 61%. And what's more, the percentage of voters living in extreme landslide counties, where the winner took it by more than 50 points, that number quintupled.
So we've gone from a country where most of us lived in politically mixed communities to a country where the majority of us live in a place where nearly everyone votes the same way. What are the compounding effects of that?
Well, the compounding effect is that you are rarely challenged politically. Your local paper, your local elected officials, your neighbors, your schools, they all reinforce the same political viewpoint. And this makes it much easier for partisans to believe that the other side is fundamentally strange, alien, or even immoral, because you just don't encounter them as equals or as neighbors.
And these political divisions are now cemented by things that aren't even political. These subtle cultural cues that signal team identity. The study on housing preferences is a great example of this.
Yes. A 2017 Pew study found this really strong defining divide. 65% of Republicans would rather live in a community where houses are larger and farther apart and schools and shopping aren't nearby.
And Democrats?
Meanwhile, 61% of Democrats prefer smaller houses within walking distance of schools and shopping. The simple preference for a big yard versus density, for rural or suburban life versus urban life, is now deeply political. These choices pull us physically away from each other, reinforcing that separation.
So when you stack all those identities together, race, religion, education, geography, housing preference, you get this pure, uncut version of the mega-identity. And the 2004 Club for Growth ad against Howard Dean is the perfect example of this in action.
Oh, that ad was brilliant in its cynical synthesis. It characterized Dean as the tax-hiking, government-expanding, latte-drinking, sushi-eating, Volvo-driving, New York Times reading, body-piercing, Hollywood-loving, left-wing freak show.
If you look closely at that list, very few of those things outside of the first two are actually about policy. It's a series of cultural barbs and consumer choices.
That's the genius of it. It fuses consumer choice lattes, Volvos with location, lifestyle, and media consumption into a single, unified statement of partisan hostility and cultural contempt. It signals not just what Dean believes legislatively, but who he is as a person and why you should despise him if you identify as a certain type of American.
And that is the ultimate goal of the mega-identity. It transforms a disagreement over taxes into an existential conflict over identity, moral worth, and belonging. Once that identity is established, it becomes this massive psychological fortress, and it just multiplies the pull and push of partisanship, making the system incredibly resistant to change.
So we've spent time detailing what the mega-identity is, but now we have to address the trigger. Why did the U.S. abandon that cross-cutting, overlapping party structure that defined the mid-20th century? What historical force was powerful enough to kick off this great sorting?
The consensus among scholars is pretty clear on this. This story, like so many defining chapters in American politics, it revolves around race. We have to look back at the unstable equilibrium of the 20th century National Democratic Party, what's called the Dixiecrat dilemma.
The Dixiecrat dilemma describes that period when Southern Democrats maintained this hegemonic, often violent rule in the South. They relied on poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright terror to suppress African American votes.
We really shouldn't sanitize how anti-democratic the system was.
Not at all. You had figures like Senator Theodore Bilbo, who openly advocated for violence to prevent black citizens from participating in democracy.
And yet this deeply illiberal anti-democratic wing was accommodated by the National Democratic Party. Why? Why did they put up with it?
It was purely transactional. The Dixiecrats gave the National Democrats the crucial votes they needed to maintain control of Congress and pass these massive national agendas like the New Deal and, later, pieces of the Great Society.
And in exchange.
In exchange, the National Party basically gave the Dixiecrats a free pass to enforce Jim Crow segregation and one-party rule in the South. This was the compact that kept the two parties from sorting around the deepest moral and political cleavage of the age: civil rights and race.
So the parties stayed mixed and ideologically ambiguous precisely because the national leaders prioritized legislative control over resolving the core moral conflict of the nation.
That's absolutely right. And the moment that bargain broke, the long period of depolarization ended. That compact finally snapped under two pressures. First, economic progressivism logically expanded to include African Americans. And second, the definitive choices of President Truman, who desegregated the military in 1948, and especially Lyndon Johnson.
Right, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Exactly. And Johnson famously predicted the political fallout of his decision.
He did. He recalled telling an aide that by signing the Civil Rights Act, I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come. He understood the tectonic shift he was starting.
And that leads directly to the Republican response, the refinement of the Southern strategy.
Which started with Barry Goldwater in 1964.
Right. Goldwater ran on a platform focused heavily on states' rights and opposition to federal overreach, and he managed to carry much of the old Confederacy, a region that had previously been impenetrable to Republicans. This was the key lesson. Conservative leaders realized that the language of small government, of fiscal conservatism, of deregulation could be successfully weaponized against the federal government's efforts to right America's racial wrongs.
So the ideology itself wasn't the main driver. It was a tool used to secure this newly available demographic base.
Precisely. It was a rational political choice. And over the next few decades, Southern conservatives migrated wholesale to the GOP. At the same time, Northern liberals and moderates, who were uncomfortable with the lingering presence of segregationists, found a more comfortable, more liberal home in the Democratic Party.
So the political landscape just cleared itself out.
The death of the Dixiecrat wing meant that ideological sorting was now possible across every other policy dimension: taxes, regulations, social issues. The removal of that massive, racially conservative Democratic bloc allowed the parties to become ideologically purer, setting the stage for the hyper-polarized mega-identity that we live in today. The historical anomaly of the ideologically mixed, cross-cutting party system was over.
Okay, so now we move to the mechanism, the fascinating and often, frankly, unnerving question of why we are so dedicated to these newly sorted teams. And this takes us deep into social psychology, where we learn that our political loyalty is less about rational policy calculation and much more about primal instinct and group survival.
This is where we encountered the work of Henri Tajfel, whose research was motivated by his experiences during World War II. Tajfel's core insight was that group conflict isn't fundamentally driven by objective material interest, which is what traditional political economy would suggest.
So it's not about money or resources.
Not primarily. It's driven by the instinct to classify the world into we and they, the in-group and the out-group, based on, as he put it, the lightest of cues.
It sounds almost like an automatic human subroutine, a kind of built-in necessity for social survival.
It is. And he tested this with the now famous minimal group experiments, which are, in their simplicity, almost absurd. Tajfel took boys from the same school, sharing the same social class, region, and culture, and he just randomly sorted them into groups.
And the sorting cues were meaningless, right?
Completely meaningless. In the first test, it was based on fictional results from a visual judgment exercise. They were told they were either overestimators or underestimators of dots on a screen. In the second, they were arbitrarily assigned, based on a fabricated preference for paintings by Klein versus Kandinsky.
So these groups had no shared history, no personal interaction, no material stakes tied to the group itself.
None at all. And yet, when the boys were asked to distribute real money to other anonymous participants, knowing only whether the recipient was in the Klein group or the Kandinsky group, what happened was startling.
What did they do?
Tajfel initially didn't believe this mild cue would generate any intergroup behavior, but he found what he called gratuitous discrimination. When given a choice, the boys consistently opted for distribution schemes that prioritized maximizing the gap between what their group received and what the outgroup received.
Wait, I want to drill down on that. They often chose to give their own group less total money as long as it ensured the outgroup got even less.
Yes, they prioritized maximizing the relative advantage, ensuring their side won by being distinctly better off than the other side, over maximizing their own group's overall material gain. This demonstrates the core psychological concept of positive distinctiveness. Touchville concluded, "It is the winning that seems more important to them."
So the need for a positive social identity through comparison, it just overrides objective economic interest.
That is the primal connection that underpins our modern political behavior. We are hardwired to achieve positive distinctiveness for our group, and you see this played out constantly in emotional low-stakes arenas like sports fandom.
Right. The emotional stakes in a rivalry like Duke versus Carolina are objectively zero. They don't affect your life or your income.
Not at all. Yet, as the writer Will Blythe noted, the feeling of living and dying through one's allegiance is no less real for being enacted through play and fandom. That same powerful, non-material psychological energy is what political parties now successfully harness, transforming politics into a purely zero-sum identity rivalry.
And once that identity takes over, it just warps our ability to reason objectively, which leads us to motivated reasoning. The history of the individual health insurance mandate is the perfect political demonstration of this identity protection mechanism.
Oh, it's truly bizarre in retrospect. The mandate started as a free market solution proposed by the Conservative Heritage Foundation in 1989. It was embraced by Republican governors and senators throughout the 90s and early 2000s, including Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. It was a Republican idea.
But the instant President Obama adopted it for the Affordable Care Act, the position of the entire Republican Party shifted.
Universally and instantly. Overnight, Republican leaders who had previously supported or even championed the mandate voted that it was an unconstitutional socialistic overreach. This wasn't an isolated case. We saw similar rapid flip-flops on cap and trade, the deficit, foreign policy. Positions flip instantly to serve the political in-group identity, regardless of objective policy history or intellectual consistency.
The party is protecting its identity, and the members are protecting their place within the party.
Exactly.
Okay, let's turn to what I think is the most alarming finding in this psychological research, the math test paradox, conducted by Dan Kahn. I think this finding fundamentally challenges our belief in the power of education to resolve political disputes.
Kahan wanted to understand why policy disagreements persist even among highly educated, scientifically literate people. So he gave subjects a standard math test, but then he presented them with a highly politicized math problem. Specifically, interpreting statistics related to the effectiveness of climate policies or gun control laws.
And the finding was genuinely shocking. For politically charged issues, being better at math made highly partisan subjects more likely to get the answer wrong if the correct statistical interpretation contradicted their ideological position.
Let's just break down the numbers to show how extreme this effect is. For those with weaker math skills, they were about 25 percentage points likelier to get the answer right when it bolstered their ideology. But partisans with strong math skills, the people we assume are best equipped to handle complexity, they were 45 percentage points likelier to get the right answer when it affirmed their side.
So doesn't that suggest that intelligence is actually detrimental to objective political understanding? It seems the smarter you are, the better equipped you are to use your intellect to rationalize and defend your teen's flawed position.
That is Kahan's devastating conclusion. Being better at math didn't help partisans converge on the truth. It simply drove them further apart because they possessed superior mental tools to engage in motivated reasoning.
Which is the process where we use reason to achieve a preferred end, like maintaining our group status, rather than to discover objective truth.
Exactly. And this leads directly to Kahan's conclusion about rational self-deception. If we're not being irrational, what are we doing?
Right.
Kahan argues that individuals are acting rationally, not scientifically or objectively, but socially. Consider the average citizen. What is the personal material cost of being wrong about, say, the scientific consensus on climate change?
It's zero. My individual opinion is not going to affect the global climate.
It's zero. But what is the cost of being out of sync with her peers? It's potentially catastrophic. You risk being marginalized, shamed, or even exiled from your community or your professional circle.
So the cost of maintaining your identity within the group far outweighs the zero cost of being factually incorrect about some distant policy matter.
Precisely. It is individually rational to prioritize social belonging over objective facts when those facts threaten your tribe. Therefore, the desire to satisfy our interest in self-expression and group identity consistently overrides the search for objective truth or even material self-interest.
And this cost of dissent is very real, even at the highest levels of political commentary. I recall the anecdote about conservative pundit David Brooks reflecting on the agony of criticizing his party's choice in 2016. He described how his social life changed and his weekends became filled with howling silences as his political circle abandoned him.
And that is the social penalty for defying the in-group. If political elites who have established careers feel that pressure, imagine the pressure on an ordinary voter or local politician. This deep psychological wiring is the engine of polarization, making us willing to accept almost any policy or any candidate, so long as they wear the right jersey.
So that deeply entrenched psychological wiring, that need for group affirmation, is now running headfirst into one of the most powerful and undeniable forces in modern American life: demographic change. And this collision, it creates a potent, destabilizing political catalyst. Let's start by just contextualizing the speed of this shift.
The pace of change is massive and historically significant. The foreign-born population is rising rapidly. It's projected to hit 17% by 2060, which was surpassed the record highs set during the Great Immigration Wave of 1890.
Wow.
And crucially, white deaths now outnumber white births in 26 states. The historical cornerstone of American political life, the white Christian majority, has effectively vanished. In 2008, 54% of the country was white and Christian. By 2016, that had fallen to 43%.
That is a fundamental reshaping of the nation in a single decade. And studies show that this speed of change naturally primes political anxiety, particularly among the historical majority.
It creates a powerful priming effect. Psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson conducted experiments showing this consequence. When white political independents were exposed to the mere statistical fact that America is becoming majority-minority, they reacted by shifting sharply toward conservative policies.
And they weren't just shifting on immigration, right? It was a broad, systemic shift.
It was a systemic shift,
Yeah.
covering everything from defense spending to healthcare reform. They became 13 points likelier to favor the Republican Party simply from being reminded of the demographic shift, regardless of the policies offered. It's an identity defense mechanism.
The Harvard social scientist Ryan Enos took this a step further with a really astonishing field experiment focused on localized exposure.
Enos wanted to test if simple, non-threatening exposure to diversity could trigger this political shift. So he sent Spanish speakers to randomly selected train stations in white suburbs around Boston for 3 days, just riding the train and interacting normally.
So, no conflict, no direct threat, just a subtle change in their immediate environment. What were the political effects on the white, mostly liberal, democratic train passengers?
The change was sharp and rapid. After just those 3 days, the attitudes of these passengers shifted significantly rightward. They were measurably more likely to endorse more aggressive immigration policies, even those similar to the most extreme policies endorsed by Trump, like deporting children of undocumented immigrants.
How does non-threatening, subtle exposure lead to such aggressive policy endorsements? That's the core insight we need to unpack.
It activates the in-group, out-group instinct. The subtle change signals threat perception. Even if the Spanish speakers were polite, the mere presence of a rapidly growing outgroup, symbolized by a different language and appearance in a previously homogeneous space, signals that the in-group's dominance is eroding. Identity defense mechanisms kick in immediately, leading to a demand for policies that reinforce the traditional boundaries of the group.
This context completely reframes the racialization of politics during the Obama era. I mean, many people hoped it would usher in a post-racial moment.
Michael Tesler's work showed it did the opposite. Obama's presidency did not decrease racialization. It further racialized politics by making racial attitudes a powerful predictor for almost every political question.
We saw this in the healthcare divide we discussed earlier.
Right. The black-white divide on Obamacare was 20 points wider than it had been on a similar plan proposed by Bill Clinton. Identity had taken over the policy debate completely.
And this identity anxiety often gets misdiagnosed as economic anxiety, but the research suggests that causality is backwards.
It does. The standard argument was that economic stagnation led to frustration, which was then channeled by political leaders into racial resentment. But Sides, Tesler, and Vavrek demonstrated that it was actually racial resentment that activated economic anxiety.
Oh, so?
Before Obama, racial resentment wasn't strongly correlated with white perceptions of the economy. By 2012, the greater someone's level of racial resentment, the worse they believed the economy was doing.
And we saw the immediate reversal of this anxiety when the Republican team won the presidency.
That's the most telling data point. Following Trump's election in 2016, Republican economic confidence jumped a massive 80 points, even though the economy itself showed similar trends to the final years of the Obama administration. The economic pessimism vanished instantly because their team was in power.
Proving the anxiety was a rationalization of an identity conflict, not a reflection of objective material reality.
Exactly. People felt the economy was bad because their group identity felt threatened, and that feeling vanished the instant the threat receded. And this is all amplified by the fundamental cultural power imbalance in the United States, which is destabilizing our entire system.
Can you explain that imbalance?
We have a deep structural mismatch. Political power driven by the Senate structure, the Electoral College, and gerrymandering runs, roughly speaking, a decade behind demographics. These institutions amplify the influence of older, whiter, more rural, and more Christian voters. They act as a structural brake on change.
But cultural power, the media, brands, entertainment, large corporations, runs ahead of demographics, chasing younger, more diverse, more urban audiences. This is where you see the woke controversies, like the Gillette ad, or clashes on elite university campuses, which get enormous media attention.
And the result is a system where the left feels a cultural and demographic power that it often fails to translate into political victories. Meanwhile, the right wields considerable political power thanks to the institutional structure, but feels constantly attacked, dismissed, and culturally under siege by corporations, Hollywood, and elite academia.
So this tension, the right feeling culturally dismissed while holding structural political power, and the left feeling culturally validated while struggling to convert that into lasting political wins, this is the core context for the fury that fueled the 2016 election and the polarization that continues today.
The political system is structurally primed for a maximum tension conflict between these two forces. So given this psychological and demographic context, we have to examine how the institutions of politics campaigns, money, media, how they adapted to and then subsequently intensified this polarized world.
It starts with the campaign strategy shift, the death of the swing voter and the rise of the post-persuasion election strategy.
Right. Matthew Dowd, who was the Republican strategist for George W. Bush, he realized after the 2000 election that the number of truly persuadable voters, those who would genuinely vote for either party based on the debate season, had plummeted.
From what to what?
From approximately 22% of the electorate to a mere 7%.
That is a staggering drop, and it forces a complete reevaluation of how you spend campaign money. I mean, if only 7% are persuadable, why spend 80% of your resources talking to them?
Exactly. The strategy flipped entirely. Campaigns shifted their resources toward base mobilization winning, not by converting the middle, but by increasing turnout among strong partisans. The goal became brightening the distinctions between the parties, not blurring them. Parties contact strong partisans at far higher rates than independents because they know the political energy is found within the committed base.
And this base mobilization strategy is heavily subsidized by a new system of incentives that's tied to political money, rewarding confrontation over compromise.
The money system has created a decisive advantage for the purist over the pragmatist. Traditional institutional party donors, like corporate PACs or longtime wealthy backers, they tend to be pragmatic. They prioritize winning and are willing to support moderates.
But small individual donors.
We're grassroots, the high-volume givers. They are polarized, they are purist, and they are primarily motivated by outrage and identity.
So the goal of a politician who's seeking mass funding shifts from showing legislative competence to generating viral outrage.
That's the Joe Wilson effect in action. South Carolina Congressman Joe Wilson was an obscure backbencher until 2009. During a televised address by President Obama, Wilson shouted, "You lie."
A major breach of decorum.
A huge breach.
Yeah.
And a violation of Senate rules. Yet instead of being punished, Wilson instantly became a GOP celebrity and a national fundraiser, raising nearly $2 million in small-dollar donations in the weeks that followed.
The lesson was immediate and clear for every ambitious politician. Confrontation, outrage, and being the most visible defender of the in-group not moderation or conciliation maximizes attention and, crucially, maximizes small-dollar funding. The incentive structure rewards toxicity.
And this shift is mirrored and massively amplified by the media landscape, which operates under the crushing reality of the attention economy.
Right. Modern journalism can't rely on gravity anymore. It has to compete with everything: sleep, video games, streaming services. So the strategy shifts from being everything to everyone to being the most appealing thing to some people.
And what appeals most to politically engaged people? Outrage. Outrage and identity threat are primal motivators. Therefore, the central, unspoken principle of political reporting becomes, if it outrages, it leads. Polarized media constantly weaponizes differences, highlights controversies, and minimizes or ignores common ground, ensuring that our political identity is continually activated.
This brings us to the rise of social media. The internet didn't create identity politics, but it confirmed that identity was the ultimate currency for attention. I'm thinking of Jonah Peretti, the co-founder of BuzzFeed, and his concept of the identity slingshot.
Peretti realized early on that content based on identity was the slingshot that drove sharing. People share content like 14 things only anxious people will understand or X things only a Y would understand, not just because they're interested, but because they're curating a public-facing identity.
So sharing content becomes a signal of group membership and identity.
Exactly. We're not sharing political content to inform others. We're sharing it to affirm who we are and who they are. This just confirms that underlying psychological mechanism. We use politics and media not just to gather information, but primarily to express our belonging and commitment to our tribe.
Okay, so if we acknowledge that we are trapped in these feedback loops, constantly exposed to our own side being reinforced, maybe the solution is forced exposure to opposing views. The sources address this exact question with the Twitter bots study.
It was a fascinating, important study. Partisans were paid to follow Twitter bots that exclusively retweeted elected officials and opinion leaders from the opposing party, forcing them into exposure they would naturally avoid. The expectation was that maybe understanding the other side might lead to moderation.
But the finding was the opposite.
The finding was clear. Exposure did not moderate views. In fact, it often led to deeper certainty and more polarized policy positions. Republicans, after exposure, became more conservative, and Democrats, if they shifted at all, became more liberal.
Why? Why did seeing the other side's opinions solidify their own?
Because the exposure acted as negative confirmation. When partisans encountered opposing viewpoints, they didn't see reasonable alternatives. They saw positions they already disliked, which confirmed their pre-existing belief that the other side was dangerous or ridiculous or wrong. It solidified their own in-group identity by providing tangible examples of the threatening outgroup.
So exposure, fueled by identity, just drove them further into their own corners.
Exactly. The result is that political elites, addicted to this hyperpolarized media, create a more polarized system, forcing the rest of the country to choose from increasingly polarized options.
And now we come to the final and really devastating phase of this deep dive, the systemic consequences. Our constitutional system was built on the assumption that parties would remain diffuse and cross-cutting. Now that they are ideologically pure and nationalized, they are incapable of compromising and the system is breaking.
We have to start with political scientist Juan Linz's seminal work on the perils of presidentialism. Linz argued that the U.S. presidential system, where the executive and legislature are elected separately, each claiming a mandate, is inherently prone to crisis.
Why is that?
Because both the president and a legislative opposition can claim democratic legitimacy, often leading to conflict that elsewhere, he argued, tempts the military to intervene.
That sounds incredibly unstable. Why did the U.S. survive this instability for so long?
Linz argued it only worked because U.S. parties were uniquely diffuse. Because Republicans and Democrats weren't pure ideological teams, the conflict between the president and Congress was rarely absolute. The president could always find votes in the opposition party, and the opposition party contained elements that supported the president's position.
But now that the parties are ideologically pure and locked in this zero-sum conflict, that internal mechanism for stability has failed completely.
It's gone. And we saw the collapse of these historical democratic norms, epitomized by the 2016 Merrick Garland Supreme Court vacancy.
This was the definitive moment of norm destruction. Garland was a moderate, highly respected appeals court judge who had previously been praised by senior Republicans. Orrin Hatch called him a consensus nominee in 2010.
Yet, Mitch McConnell refused to even grant him a hearing or a vote.
McConnell rationalized this unprecedented obstruction by saying the choice belonged to the next president, essentially holding the Supreme Court seat open for nearly a year.
And he succeeded because the stakes of the Supreme Court had become existential. As the parties became more ideological, the Supreme Court became fully polarized. Justices today rarely vote against the ideology of the president who appointed them. Lifetime appointments are now zero-sum political warfare.
So McConnell broke an informal historical practice, the norm of consideration, to secure a partisan win for his base, and his voters rewarded him for his ruthlessness.
And this failure highlights the structural dysfunction. where nationalized votes conflict with localized power structures.
Right, that structural imbalance. The Senate, the Electoral College, gerrymandering gives disproportionate power to sparser, whiter, older, more Christian voters. And this grants the Republican Party a massive, ongoing geographic advantage.
It does. And the political consequences of this advantage are huge. The GOP has lost the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections.
So if they were forced to win the popular vote to win the presidency, they would have moderated long ago to appeal to the median voter.
Exactly. Instead, they have learned to win power by winning land rather than by winning hearts and minds. This structural safety net solidifies their conservative confrontational path because they don't need to appeal to the national majority.
This shift has fundamentally killed transactional politics, which was the messy, often dirty mechanism that allowed the dysfunctional system to actually function in the first place.
The primary example is the death of earmarks. Congressional pork spending used to fund specific projects in specific districts. Earmarks were criticized as dirty or corrupt, but they were the essential currency of cooperation.
The legislative grease.
They were. John Allen detailed how leaders like Democrat Jack Murtha would trade earmarks to Republican leader Tom DeLay to literally buy bipartisan cooperation on bills that otherwise wouldn't pass. By eliminating earmarks in 2011, Congress eliminated the ability to bribe the opposition with tangible local benefits.
It destroyed the ability to compromise. You can't ask a member of the opposition to cross the aisle and vote for your bill if you can't offer them anything in return that makes them look good back home.
And when Nebraska Senator Ben Nelson tried to engage in transactional politics on the ACA, extracting the infamous Cornhusker kickback for his state in exchange for his crucial vote, the mega-identity system immediately went to war.
The outrage was intense. He was branded a self-dealing villain, he was forced to back down, and he eventually retired.
The lesson was delivered clearly. In the era of mega-identity and outrage media, transactional politics is now self-destructive for the moderate. Compromise is punished, and purity is rewarded. This is why gridlock is the necessary, predictable outcome.
And the ultimate symptom of this is the routine filibuster, which has transformed the ability of Congress to govern.
Historically, the filibuster was an extreme tactic, rarely used. From 1917 to 1970, the Senate voted less than once a year to break a filibuster. Today, it is a routine, assumed tool of minority obstruction.
The numbers are pretty staggering.
They are. In the 2013-2014 congressional session alone, the Senate took 218 cloture votes to break filibusters. It's no longer a break-glass measure. It's the standard operating procedure. This allows the minority party to paralyze governance entirely, ensuring that nothing can pass without a supermajority.
And this paralysis is strategic, right? It destroys accountability.
Absolutely. The minority can blame the resulting gridlock on the majority, frustrating voters who only see failure. Bipartisan cooperation is often necessary for good governance, but it has become completely irrational for the minority party to offer it, because their primary goal is to frustrate the majority and seize power, not solve problems. The system is designed to fail when parties stop compromising.
So we've completed this deep dive into the logic of polarization. And what we found is that the apparent chaos of American politics, particularly exemplified by the bizarre election of 2016, was actually the predictable, stable outcome of these deep, complex feedback systems.
Right. These systems are driven by the history of racial sorting, reinforced by primal psychological instincts, amplified by the mega-identity, and maximized by institutional and media incentives that now reward confrontation over compromise.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the key lesson seems to be that we aren't just using politics for our own ends. Politics is constantly using us for its own ends.
It's compelling us to reinforce these polarized identities through confrontation and outrage. Identity has become the single greatest driver of political behavior, overriding our ability to process facts, history, or even our own material interests. The question for us now is how we as individuals can regain agency within this hyperpolarized system that constantly demands our emotional energy.
That leads to a powerful and I think provocative final thought for you. If our political identity is just one of many identities stacked up, like Republican, Democrat, or Independent, what if we intentionally focused on activating other cross-cutting identities?
What do you mean by that?
Well, we can choose to exercise identities like fair-minded neighbor, curious citizen, lifelong learner, or parent committed to community stability. We can depolarize ourselves in small ways by being mindful of which identity the national political machine is trying to activate and intentionally exercising those other identities like muscles.
That's interesting.
The story of Eric Hagerman, the man who chose to tune out all national political media entirely after 2016 to focus his energy on restoring his local Ohio pig farm as a community restoration project, presents a challenging example. It's a question of reallocating your identity and your effort away from the corrosive national mega-identity stack and toward something tangible, local, and unifying.
A powerful closing thought for you to consider. Where are you placing your focus and which identity is in control?
If you'd prefer a shorter visual explanation of these ideas, check the description for the Mini Explainer companion video. And if you're watching the Mini Explainer first, you'll find a link back to this full deep dive for those wanting a deeper exploration.